I'm Jeremy and I'm here at the TRQ Research and Development Facility where we test all kinds of parts on a fleet of vehicles. And today we're going to be putting rotors and pads on a 2010 Toyota Rav4. So let's get started. We're going to crack these lug nuts loose while the car is on the ground because once we jack up the car, it'll be much easier to take these lug nuts off. These are 21mm lug nuts. So now that the car is up in the air, we're going to take each one of these lug nuts off and then pull the wheel off. So I've now just taken off all 5 lug nuts, and as you can see, the wheel is stuck on the hub. So the easy way to fix this is to put one of the nuts back on. Just put it on finger tight. You're just trying to prevent the wheel from not falling off unexpectedly. And then we're going to go to the back side of the wheel and pop it off with a pry bar. We're going to just put it up here against the ball joint and pry against the wheel. And as you can see, it pops right off. And then we'll take the wheel off the car. Right here and right here are your caliper bolts. They're both 14mm. We're going to take those out first. We'll start with the top one. We're using a 3/8 drive ratchet and a 14mm socket. Usually once you crack them loose, they come right out by hand. All right, so now we're at a point where we can pull the caliper off. What I like to do is pull on the caliper a little bit, and that compresses the piston inside it just a hair to release the caliper. So now the caliper's off, and we want to hang it from the strut because if you hang it from the hose, it'll damage the hose. So I have just an old coat hanger here, which I'm going to feed through the caliper and then hook onto the strut. And that should hold my caliper out of the way. So we're now at a point where we can pull these brake pads out. So we'll pull the first one out. Here's the front pad. You can see these pads are actually still good, but we're going to show you how to replace them anyways because that's why we make the videos. So we'll set these aside for now. And now we're going to remove these 2 bolts which hold the caliper bracket onto the knuckle. Now they are 17mm, so I'm going to use my 17mm socket with a 3/8 drive ratchet, and I'm going to loosen them up. Now it may take some force, so a 1/2" ratchet might be a little easier, but let's try it out. Looks like it worked. Now we'll go to the bottom one. All right, with those bolts out, now you can pull the caliper bracket right off the car. So now we're at a point where we can pull this rotor off, but as you can see, it's stuck on there pretty good. They usually get stuck right around the center, just from rusting against the hub. So luckily, what a lot of manufacturers do is they put these 2 holes in the rotor, which you can thread bolts into, and that bolt will push against the hub, and it will bring the rotor right off the car. So what we're going to do is spray it with some rust penetrant, just to kind of clean it out a little bit, like so. And then we grabbed a couple of bolts from our bucket of bolts that we have laying around, and we're going to thread these right into the holes. All right, so now we're going to just tighten them up, and hopefully this rotor will just pull right off the hub. You can see it's starting to release on this side. So let's go to the other side and tighten that up. Hey, that's great. All right, so now the rotor's off. You can pull it off and you can see the rust buildup around here. That's what holds the rotor on. And then you can see the 2 points where we push the bolt against it. All right, let's move on. All right, so here we have the old parts and the new parts. You can see the new ones are ceramic pads and they look just like the original ones. They mount the same. They have the same tabs on the end to slide into the caliper brackets. This one happens to be a drilled and slotted rotor, which TRQ carries drilled and slotted rotors, but they also carry a massive line of OE style rotors just like this one. So if you want to go more performance oriented, you can go this direction. If you're just looking for a stock replacement, TRQ has that as well. On the opposite side, you can see that they are actually very much the same on the opposite side as well. You can see it's got the bolt holes here for the screws to go in when you need to replace them, you know, in the future, just like the original ones. And the thickness is the same. So it's going to get you back on the road in no time. Should fit function and perform just like the original one. So now we want to clean up the rust that's around the center of the hub, because we obviously don't want the new rotor to be, not sitting flat against the hub. So I'm going to use a wire brush, and I'm just going to clean up all around the edges of the hub. All right, so now we're just going to slide the rotor into place over the hub. Sometimes I like to put a lug nut on there just to kind of hold it in place while I'm working with it. That way it doesn't slide off and get in a weird position when I'm putting the pads on. So here we have the caliper bracket, and there's a few things that you want to do before you put this back on the car. One of the things is you want to make sure that these things slide in and out smoothly. So this one, you can see it's a little bit sticky, so we'll want to clean that out. This one, kind of the same thing. There's probably some old grease in it, so we'll clean that out. And then down here are some brackets. On each side of the caliper, there's these little stainless brackets. And we want to pop these off and just clean the whole area really well. Because if your brake pads stick, then you'll end up wearing them unevenly, and you have to replace them sooner than you should. So we'll pop these things off, and we'll clean them with some brake parts cleaner and a wire brush. Make sure everything's nice and clean for the brake pads to ride on. I'm going to spray it down with some brake parts cleaner and then get it with a wire brush to make sure the whole area is nice and clean. So now we're going to clip these brackets right back in here. And with them clipped back in, I'm going to spray them down and clean them with the wire brush. That way they'll be held in place by the caliper bracket while I clean them. All right, so now the actual caliper brackets here are nice and clean. So now we're going to pull out these slider pins. And I just want to make sure that there's no rust inside, and I want to make sure they're nice and clean, and maybe even have a nice new coating of grease. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean these off. And you don't want a lot of grease on these things. You just want the lightest possible coating, because if you put too much grease, then they won't slide all the way in the hole, and it creates like a hydraulic situation that's not good. So we're just going to put a light coating of grease on here, and then put it right back in the hole and make sure that it slides in and out nice and easily. The other thing to note on this is that the bottom bolt is a little bit different than the top bolt. So initially they look the same, but once you clean them, you'll notice that this one has a rubber ring on the bottom of it. So this is the bottom bolt. You want to make sure you put them in the right spots. Came out the bottom, so put it right back in the bottom. And then we'll put a little grease on it, just a dab. Again, you don't want to put too much, and then we'll slide it right back in, and then we'll make sure that it moves in and out nice and smooth. All right. If these things were rusty, you'd want to either replace your caliper altogether, or get some new bolts, or clean them really, really well so that there's no rust in there, and then re-grease them to make sure that they move smoothly. Your caliper rides on these, and if they become stuck, you'll end up wearing your brake pads unevenly, which you don't want. All right, so we're going to slide the caliper bracket right back onto the knuckle and put the two bolts back in. Just like that. And we'll snug them up with the 17mm socket on the 3/8 ratchet. So we're at a point where we can slide the brake pads in. What I like to do is put a little dab of grease right on these ears, here and here. And that way, when they're in the sliders in the caliper bracket, they will hopefully slide for a long time to come. Around New England, where we are, this is a problem because rust builds up in these caliper brackets, and it ends up making the brake pad stick. So we want to prevent that, so that's why I like to put the grease on the edge of the brake pads like that. Not everybody does it, it's sort of a preference thing, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because that's just how I do it. You obviously don't want to get your grease on the pad itself or on the rotor, so you have to be extra careful. All right, now they're in place. So we're at a point where we need to compress this piston into the caliper. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. You could use some big groove jaw pliers, you could use a big C-clamp, or if you have a brake piston caliper compression tool, you can use that as well. So that's what we're going to use because we happen to have one here. All you do is put it in here, and then you can compress the piston. All right, it's all compressed. So now we're going to slide this onto the caliper bracket. So now we can put the 2 bolts in the caliper, and they are supposed to be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. And earlier, we tightened up the caliper brackets, and we're going to torque those to 79 foot-pounds as well. So we'll do this one first to 25 foot-pounds. All right, we got that. Perfect. All right, so now we're going to do the caliper brackets to 79 foot-pounds. All right, it's all torqued to spec. We can put the wheel back on the car. So we're going to lift it up, slide it right on. And then always start your lug nuts by hand because you don't want to cross thread them. Now I like to tighten all these up by hand before I actually put the torque wrench on. That one's a little stiff, so we'll go to this one. All right, we've now got our torque wrench set to 76 foot-pounds, and we're going to go ahead and torque this. Now that it's back on the ground, we can torque it and the wheel won't turn. So let's do that. I just like double checking them, just in case I missed one or something. All right, now we're all torqued.